It all started on a crisp fall morning in 2005. I was just another high school student trying to survive the daily grind. My school was old, with a history that stretched back nearly a century. The building creaked and groaned, as if it had a life of its own. I never paid much attention to it until that day. I had just transferred to the school, and I was assigned locker number 237. The locker was in the farthest, darkest corner of the hallway, almost as if it was hidden away on purpose. At first, I didn't think much of it, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. On the first day, I found a note inside the locker. It was written in shaky handwriting that looked almost childlike. It simply said, "Help me." I figured it was some sort of prank and ignored it, shoving my books into the locker and slamming it shut. But the notes kept coming. Every day, there was a new one waiting for me. "I'm trapped. They won't let me out. Please, I need your help." The handwriting was always the same, desperate and uneven. One day I decided to stay after school to see who was messing with me. I hid around the corner, watching the locker. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. But no one came. After what felt like hours, I gave up and walked over to the locker. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside was a small, dusty box. It hadn't been there before. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box, revealing an old, yellowed photograph of a young girl. She looked no older than 12, her eyes wide with fear. As I held the photograph, I felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. The lights flickered, and I heard a faint whisper, "Help me." I dropped the photograph and slammed the locker shut. I ran out of the school, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The girl's face was etched into my mind, her eyes haunting me. The next day, I tried to tell my friends, but they laughed it off. They said it was just a stupid prank, that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to do some research. I spent hours in the library, digging through old newspapers and yearbooks. And then I found it. A story from 1952 about a girl who had gone missing. Her name was Emily Thompson, and she had been a student at my school. The last place she was seen was by her locker, number 237. My blood ran cold as I realized that Emily had been trying to reach out to me. The notes, the photograph, they were all her cries for help. But there was nothing I could do. Emily had been dead for over 50 years. I tried to avoid the locker after that, but it was impossible. I had to pass by it every day, and every time I did, I could feel her presence. The air would grow colder, and I would hear that same faint whisper, "Help me." One day I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the locker one last time, hoping to find some sort of closure. But the locker was empty. No notes, no photograph, nothing. It was as if Emily had never existed. I switched lockers the next day, but the memory of Emily Thompson stayed with me. I could still feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, still hear her desperate whispers, "Help me." The school eventually tore down the old building and built a new one, but I knew that Emily's spirit would never rest. Even now, all these years later, I still think about her. I wonder if she is still trapped in that old locker, waiting for someone to help her. I hope wherever she is, she finally found peace. The year was 1998, and I was in middle school. The school had always had a creepy vibe, but I figured it was just because it was old and run down. The janitor was an old man named Mr. Harlan, who had been working there for as long as anyone could remember. He was quiet, kept to himself, and most of the kids thought he was weird. But I always thought he was just lonely. One day, Mr. Harlan didn't show up for work. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he quit, others said he died. But no one really knew. A week later, the school got a new janitor, and Mr. Harlan was all but forgotten. Except he wasn't. It was a cold November afternoon when I stayed late at school to finish a project. I was in the art room, which was in the basement, one of the creepiest parts of the school. The lights were dim, and the silence was deafening. As I was packing up my things to leave, I heard a faint sound. It was a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was the new janitor cleaning up, but when I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. The sound grew louder, and my heart started to race. I followed the noise down the hall around the corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, I saw him. Mr. Harlan. He was standing in front of a supply closet, his back to me. His head was bent low, and he seemed to be struggling with something. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How could this be? Mr. Harlan was gone. Before I could move, he turned around. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile.
"You shouldn't be here,"
he whispered, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, as Mr. Harlan slowly walked toward me. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, each one louder than the last. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. "Don't tell anyone you saw me," he hissed. "They'll think you're crazy." And then just like that, he was gone. 1 second he was there, and the next, he vanished into thin air. I bolted out of the school, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I never told anyone what I saw that day. Who would believe me? But I knew what I saw. Mr. Harlan wasn't gone, at least not completely. His ghost was still lingering in that school, trapped in the basement, where he had spent most of his life. After that day, I never stayed late at school again. The thought of running into Mr. Harlan's ghost sent chills down my spine. But even now, years later, I can't forget the look in his eyes, the way his voice sounded like it came from the depths of hell. Sometimes I wonder if he's still there, wandering the halls, waiting for the next unlucky student to stumble upon him. I hope, for their sake, that they never do. In 2010, I was a senior in high school, ready to finish my last year and move on with my life. My school had its fair share of strange stories, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that October. Mrs. Whitaker was one of those teachers everyone loved. She taught English and had a passion for literature that was contagious. But there was something off about her that year. She seemed distant, distracted, like she was carrying a heavy burden. One day, she didn't show up for class. The substitute told us that Mrs. Whitaker was taking some time off for personal reasons. Weeks passed and still no sign of her. The rumors started swirling. Some said she had a breakdown, and others claimed she ran away. But no one knew the truth. Then, on October 21st, something strange happened. I was in the library working on an essay. The place was nearly empty, except for a few other students. As I was typing away, I heard someone calling my name. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was clear as day.
"Come here."
I looked around, but no one was there. I figured I was just hearing things and went back to my work. But then I heard it again, louder this time.
"Come here."
The voice was coming from behind a row of bookshelves at the back of the library. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the shelves, my heart pounding in my chest. When I turned the corner, I saw her, Mrs. Whitaker. She was standing there, her back to me, staring at a blank spot on the wall. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't respond, just kept staring at the wall. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed something was wrong. Her reflection in the glass of a nearby window. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring back at me, while the real Mrs. Whitaker remained motionless. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out again, but she didn't budge. Her reflection continued to stand there, staring directly at me, as if it was alive on its own. I could feel my heart racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was terribly wrong, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were glued to the floor. I forced myself to take a step forward, and as I did, Mrs. Whitaker slowly turned around. Her eyes were vacant, as if she was looking right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was about to speak. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She finally spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once.
Help me,
she said, her lips barely moving. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I took another step back, trying to get away, but her reflection was still there, watching me. I turned to run, but as I did, the door to the library slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in, and I fumbled for my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. When I finally managed to get it on, the light was dim, barely cutting through the thick darkness. I shined it towards where Mrs. Whitaker had been standing, but she was gone. The entire room was empty. I raced to the door, yanking it open and running down the hallway as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold autumn air hitting my face. I looked back at the school, expecting to see something or someone following me. But the hallway was empty. The next day I tried to tell my friends what had happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. Mrs. Whitaker never returned to school, and the principal claimed she had moved away suddenly, without explanation. But I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to her, something beyond what any of us could understand. I started researching, trying to find any clue about what I had seen. I dug through old newspapers, online forums, anything that might give me an answer. It turns out, I wasn't the first student to experience something like this. Over the years, there had been stories of other teachers disappearing, strange occurrences in the school that no one could explain. It was as if the school itself was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. I eventually graduated and moved on, but the memory of that day has never left me. Sometimes I still dream about Mrs. Whitaker, standing there in the library, her empty eyes staring back at me. And in those dreams, I can still hear her voice, distorted and haunting, whispering,
help me.
But no matter how many times I have that dream, I know there's nothing I can do. Mrs. Whitaker is gone, lost to whatever darkness had consumed her.